I was saying towards the end of the lecture last week that the Enlightenment during the course of the 19th century began to fracture. It fractured because of the understanding of reason which developed during that century. One could see the fault lines, especially in the relationship between science and religion, which we looked at last time, which resulted in the claim from the science side that its version of reason could explain everything, including the data of religion, and the claim on the religious side that its data of revelation could explain everything about human life, including what it would then call pseudo-science. So we saw reductionism emerge in science, and we saw on the Protestant side of the Reformation the emergence of fundamentalism, and on its Catholic side we saw the emergence of the claim of papal infallibility. And I suggested at the end of our discussion last time that when you see reason fracturing in that way into differing, mutually exclusive ideologies, no one should have predicted a pretty picture in the 20th century. And indeed, the 20th century, from the point of view of the application of reason, looks remarkably dismal. But I think it would have been difficult to predict how bad it would truly be. And this is especially evident in the development of genocidal policies during the course of the 20th century. I'm going to turn to them today and to suggest that they are, to some extent, a problem of a misappropriation of what religion is. And as a result of that, I'll suggest that there are certain signs that there might be a productive religious response to these continuing genocides. Now, I begin towards the bottom of page 1 with a genocide which is obviously not from the 20th century because it is from the 13th. It was actually declared in 1209. And I do this to suggest that genocide is by no means a modern phenomenon. It's just that it's been perfected in the modern period and become remarkably routine. It goes back, as far as I am aware, as a policy, to the 8th century before the Common Era, when the Assyrian Empire destroyed the entire northern kingdom of Israel, exiled the prominent members of its population, and brought people from elsewhere in its empire to Galilee and Samaria in order completely to overwhelm Israelite culture. If you've ever heard the expression, the 10 lost tribes of Israel, that's what they're talking about, and they are permanently lost, whatever legends you might have heard. The Assyrian policy then was highly effective. You don't need technology for genocide, though once you have it, you might be tempted to employ that policy more often, and that's part of the story of the 20th century. But back in the 13th century, Pope Innocent III was outraged by the teaching of the Cathar in France, who held that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' concubine. They didn't have the benefit of the papyrus recently discovered, which papyrus, by the way, although it's called the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, the term wife does not occur in the papyrus. The term used is woman. Not every woman is a wife. Someone should have explained this to those who are popularizing the Gospel of Jesus' wife. But the Cathar really did teach that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' concubine, and Innocent was outraged by that teaching, and he was outraged by the fact that the Cathar refused to pay tithe, the 10%, to their churches, on the grounds that human institutions were corrupt and not a part of the Spirit of God. So Innocent actually declared a crusade in France against the Cathars. And I give the example of the destruction of the entire population of Béziers in the year 1209, and that destruction was deliberately planned to occur on the 22nd of July, the feast day of Mary Magdalene. The genocide was inflicted as part of the decision that they should be punished for their teaching. So genocide as a policy has been about. But the question is, what happens to the genocidal option, if we can consider it that, when it's incorporated into the system set out by Christianity in the modern period? And just by way of reminder, I give you that system over on page 2, in which the fundamental ritual consists of the particular community that defines the people of God. The meaning is attributed directly to a relationship to Christ, and committed faith becomes the governing ethic. And it is that emphasis upon commitment on the ethical side that has led to additional requirements within some examples of Protestantism which have become fundamentalist, and some examples of Catholicism that have insisted upon papal infallibility. But how is it, then, that genocidal policies arise? I give some examples. I've chosen them because they're especially prominent, widely agreed in the literature, and on the whole, I have gone to a median range of the number of victims of the genocide concerned that have been estimated within the literature. So the first takes a very long time. I just date it from 1787. That is the ratification of the Constitution of the United States. Between then and 1900, something like 12 million indigenous Americans died. They died as a result of their exposure to diseases to which they had low immunity, for example, smallpox. Some of that contagion happened as a matter of happenstance. Some of it happened as a result of deliberate policy. The decision to bring blankets that had been used on smallpox victims to American Indian communities in order to take care of a local problem. Sometimes this was a matter of dispossession, forced movement from one part of the country to another. But the estimate is that something like 12 million people perished by the time 1900 was reached, under the general banner of manifest destiny, the conception that the citizens of the United States had the right to this land, and therefore that implied that indigenous Americans did not. I give the example also of the Armenian genocide under the Ottoman Empire. This, to some extent, overlapped with the First World War, but as you can see by the dates, did not overlap with it entirely. Between 1932 and 1933, very brief period, some 8 million people died in the Ukraine. They died for the most part of starvation because the Soviet Union had decided to expropriate the produce of their farms, and there was not an adequate amount enough for them to eat. The final solution, probably the most famous of the genocides under the Third Reich, between 1941 and 1945, not only the 6 million Jews, but something like a total of 11 million victims altogether. And of course, these numbers do not take account of what you might call ordinary war dead. These are just examples of targeted decisions that say, the lives of this group of people are not worth preserving. Immediately after the Second World War, there was an ethnic cleansing of Germans from Eastern Europe. It was a part of Soviet policy. In the course of that dispossession, approximately 2 million people perished. The Nigerian Civil War between 1967 and 1970 cost approximately 3 million victims in inter-ethnic genocides. Bangladesh in 1971, 2 million victims of the incursion by the army of Pakistan. The Pol Pot regime in Cambodia between 1975 and 1979, approximately 2 million. And I've included the Rwandan genocide, 20th anniversary, with 750,000 victims. As I said, apart from what you might call ordinary war dead, this is after the period of the Enlightenment. This is after the time that we have international organizations, after we have the definition of what crimes against humanity precisely are. What possibly can be going on? Well, one myth is exploded by a simple survey of the most obvious genocides. That myth is, all this happens because of religion. That certainly would have been a surprise to Pol Pot, to Joseph Stalin, to Adolf Hitler, to Ulysses S. Grant. The motivation for these actions indeed has some of the look of religion because it is so dedicated, so fixed on a particular ideology. And because it looks only to the community of those who are held to count as those who are to be the beneficiaries of the action, and because ethics is redefined as putting this ideology into effect rather than having a standing all of its own. Sometimes the term fundamentalism is applied to different forms of extremism, and as I said last time, I am very reserved about that usage. I'm reserved about it because it does not make a great deal of sense to me to talk, for example, about Muslim fundamentalism when we know very well that the 5 fundamentals of fundamentalism spelled out are all quite late Christian doctrines, and no one can sensibly attribute them to Muslims. Nonetheless, sometimes the word fundamentalism is used in a kind of watered-down way so that one can also speak of secular fundamentalism. And although I find that kind of fun, I think it's also misleading. Within discussion in France over the past 30 years, a different term has been used to describe those who are motivated by a particular ideological version of any philosophy or religion. They use the term intégrisme, which we would put into English in a kind of wooden way as integrism. Now, why integrism? Because their idea is these are people who are all trying to put the whole of the meaning of what they're doing into just one idea. Now, I don't think there's any future for the word integrism in the English language. It'll just not fly. I have from time to time tried, and it doesn't go anywhere whatsoever. This glider needs an engine in order to go anywhere whatsoever. And so I'm trying again. And as you see, over on page 3, immediately after the listing of the genocides that I've given you examples of, I pose the question, what kind of pseudo-religious system produces this kind of result? And I suggest that these are all examples of what I propose to refer to now as ideolatry. That is, when you take one particular idea and you make that the focus of your devotion. It is not idolatry, it is ideolatry. And an example of that would be the sense that, for example, in the case of the Ukrainian genocide, the good of the proletariat demands that all of their food should be taken away and brought into cities in Russia. Likewise, the demands of manifest destiny mean that indigenous Americans cannot be treated in the same way as colonial Americans. Racial purity demands a final solution. It's a remarkable dedication in the Third Reich in the extermination of those who were non-Aryans. Even when they're losing the war, they are using resources in order to exterminate those they didn't want around. This is what I refer to as being a quasi-religious system, where the particular ideology is held to give all meaning to everyone. And that's why within the 20th century, the fracturing of reason and the claim that an ideology gives meaning to the whole of human existence has actually promoted more extremism than we saw before the Enlightenment. We really did stop going to war about religion a long time ago. The Peace of Westphalia has held up since 1689 rather well. We don't need religion to go to war. We don't need religion to commit genocide. All we need is some ideolatry or another that says, I have the key, and we have to follow through on that program or everything else will fall apart. If there happens to be collateral damage in the course of applying our particular ideology, that is unfortunate, but it's going to occur. Now, because these forms of ideological extremism have a quasi-religious look, they have also been difficult for religious people to respond to. This ideolatry that I refer to is remarkably like the structure of modern Christianity, except instead of devotion to Christ, you have devotion to the ideal being at the very center. And what's difficult for religious people is that others within our Enlightenment community are likely to say, well, after all, your faith is a subjective matter. Stalinists have a different subjective truth. How can you really complain? That is the postmodern dilemma of my title. The view that because of the relativism within which we live, we are free to adopt the particular ideology that seems to suit us. The idea that an ideology has inherent limits, that there are places where it must not be applied because it does harm, is one which it has been extremely difficult to develop during the course of the 20th century. Still, there are those who have shown the beginning of a way in which a Christian response to these ideolatries might be articulated. I give as one example Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. King was writing that famous letter in response to local clergy who had written to him publicly and told King to stop what he was doing, that his practice of nonviolence was bringing about a tense atmosphere which was not good for the community at large, and after all, was against the law. And that's why King developed the particular edge that he did in writing this letter. saying that one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. That is, you cannot set out a fixed ideology and be content with the notion that everyone should obey it if that ideology is not subject to scrutiny in itself. And King, in developing his conception of nonviolent action, was able to develop a movement in the United States which had an obvious political result, but at the same time he was opening a possibility for a change in the religious system of Christianity, a change that takes account of historical circumstances. This belief that history needs to be taken into religion, that there are features of our common life that reveal the limitations of ideology, was also reflected in the work of Pope John the 23rd. In 1958, it's rather interesting how much was going on during the 1950s. Has the reputation of being this sedate, not very creative time. But you know, Martin Luther King, John the 23rd, not a bad record. And both of them intervening in a similar way to say, we think we know that our ideology is all correct, maybe it's not. Maybe it's time for us to reconsider what is just, what is appropriate, and to change as a result of that. And so soon after he was elected Pope in 1958, John XXIII called the Second Vatican Council, a council very much unlike the first. Remember, the first is where the conception of papal infallibility had emerged. John moved in the opposite direction because he made it very clear that he wanted to work on the basis not only of his own papal court, but on the basis of bishops from all over the Catholic world. The Catholic Church is the only institution I know where if you consult a bishop, that's democracy. But relatively speaking, that is true, because the bishops represent dioceses, actual living communities, not merely the papal court and its cardinals. Bear in mind, a cardinal is in essence nothing more than a chaplain in the city of Rome appointed by the Pope. A bishop is actually in touch with communities of believers. And this council accepted that the Mass and other sacraments should be available in the language of the people concerned. There would be a translation of the Mass and baptism. There would be translations of the Bible from the original languages, not the Vulgate alone, authorized. There would also be an allowance for local variation, and also the basic principle that salvation should be understood as coming about, first of all, as a result of the grace of God and not from human works. Hello, Reformation. It took until the Second Vatican Council for there to be some basic agreements between Catholics and Protestants about the conduct of their faith. All as a result of the revolutionary decision of John the 23rd very soon after his election. I know there are many people who are hopeful now about the election of Pope Francis. He seems to me a wonderful man, very interesting, but time has passed. And if revolution is going to occur, you need to put it into effect. John the 23rd did not wait. Part of the efficiency of his action was the fact that he understood his purpose from the outset and understood that the conditions of belief in the 20th century had changed, and therefore the articulation of the faith needed to change as well. The First Vatican Council, as well as movements on the Protestant side, including Martin Luther King, fed the growth of what came to be called liberation theology. And this is the last straw in the wind that I want to refer to. Gustavo Gutierrez wrote in his notes for a theology of liberation in 1970, the problem of development is not only its alienating privilege of profit over people, but the larger frame of how human progress should be measured. Liberation, therefore, seems to express better both the hopes of oppressed peoples and the fullness of a view in which man is seen not as passive element, but as agent of history. I suggest that what Gutierrez is here saying about people being agents in history underlies the position of Martin Luther King and underlies the position of John the 23rd. That shift, in turn, brings about the possibility that a new view of reason can be constructed, which would not be subjected to the kind of fragmentation we've seen and results in ideolatry, and also holds out the hope that a shift in the Christian system would make it possible for it to stand up more effectively against genocidal and related policies in the future. What such a Christianity would look like, we'll have to discuss in the autumn. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, please.
A few questions, a little complicated. I'll try to be very short.
Okay.
Your opening remarks about we could have predicted the 20th century based on your analysis. We can predict the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th century as well, and it doesn't look. It looks as bleak, at least from reading or hearing the way you describe the conflicts that arise from the differences in ideology. So the thought is there a solution? Is there another piece to end the religious wars, that successfully ended the religious wars by broadening the rationale for wars? We don't limit it to just religion anymore. Secondly, I don't see in the list of genocides, say the Irish famine, the African, not African, the black people who died in the first Middle Passages, those probably amount to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of deaths as well. Is there a reason is there a different definition of genocide there? And what about Anne Rand and her disciples who take away food stamps, take away health care, which results in people dying in uncountable numbers? And on the other end of the hand, what about the argument that people make about a woman's right to choose and the millions of fetuses that are aborted? Are these all deaths by some other non-natural cause, but do they count as well? Or are we going to continue this because we're hardwired for it? And if we are hardwired, as you suggested last week, and I was from a different planet, I say that's not hardwired, they're all born with it. That's what original sin is. Back to square one.
I will summarize the questions. Absolutely, no. These are wonderful points that you've made, and I'll just encapsulate them for the benefit of the Cardinal of Red Hook, and then reply to them. First, on the issue of a way out. I'm actually on the optimistic side of this, in the sense that if King and John the 23rd, in the midst of the Cold War, immediately after some of the worst genocidal activities of that time, were able, although there was nothing in their discourse to suggest that they were able to do it, to articulate an alternative to the way in which their ideologies were taking them, then it ought to be actually much more straightforward for us to do so, because we have lived longer in a postmodern environment, and it ought to be obvious to most of us that this is not working out very well. We have a very clear track record of failure, where it concerns the idea that everyone's reason should attach to ideology, and really there's not going to be much criticism between the one and the other. That's what I'm suggesting historically is our current position. And in order to evolve beyond that position, I think we also need to see a change in the religious system of Christianity from its modern emphasis on community, committed faith, and Christ to another possibility, which, as I say, I'm going to discuss in the autumn, and I'm not going to give it away. Not right here and now, but it is there, and it has to do with the study of mysticism in the 20th century, which occurred largely under the surface, was pioneered by a woman named Evelyn Underhill, and in my judgment has already changed Christianity, only people have not noticed how radically and how deeply it has been changed. And that's what I want to look into when we meet again in the autumn. So I believe that there is a way out. Then I think I indicated that I did not intend my list of genocides to be exhaustive, because it would have taken rather more trees in order to accomplish that. But I did take examples of genocide which are widely agreed to be such. I didn't want to include those which have been challenged as genocide. Now, I know there's always someone to challenge. I mean, I had a colleague a few years ago, I'd asked him to read the manuscript of a book I had written called Abraham's Curse. And it dealt a great deal with elements of the Quran and the Hadith and other parts of the Muslim tradition. And he very kindly read through it very patiently and said, your Arabic is all right, and what you say about the sources is accurate, but there was no Armenian genocide. He was from Turkey. So he was very sensitive about the idea that this should be called a genocide. There are Americans who don't think that we should call what happened to the American Indians a genocide. You can query anything, but the examples I've given are well established within the literature, and they also have a reasonable possibility of an estimate of the number of victims. The whole issue of whether we should put abortion under genocide, I know very well that, one of the moments that shows us that we're in the postmodern period is when people say things like, abortion is murder. Now, you can be against abortion. It makes perfect sense to me. You can make a moral argument against it. But in actual fact, within the tradition of Christian and particularly Catholic discussion, murder and abortion were only conflated during the 20th century. Wouldn't you know? There is an example of what I would call ideology. Anything that opposes me must mean that all forms of death are the same, therefore X equals Y. So I think that the whole issue of abortion genocide is more of a symptom of the postmodern dilemma. And then when you get to the point where you're saying, because I know that abortion is genocide, I am going to shoot doctors who provide abortion, we don't really, I think at that point, have to lecture Muslims about becoming moderate, do we? I mean, it seems to me that the kind of extremism that in the West we like to accuse Muslims of has actually become a routine part of our postmodern culture. That, I think, is the dilemma that we're facing. Then you raise the question of Ayn Rand. And my response to Ayn Rand is, Ayn Rand, philosopher, are you kidding? I mean, it would only be possible during the 20th century to confuse that with a philosophical system. I mean, it is a simple assertion of self-interest, as if that were the only principle in the world. A wonderful example of what I've called ideolatry. And I know it's embraced by many public figures, and it's held to go hand in hand with another form of ideolatry, namely monetarism, as if all you have to do is get the money right and everyone will be fine. I'll give you an example of a very interesting, hopeful sign just recently, just from this past week. When Christine Lagarde, who's the new head of the IMF, was talking about concerns of development. Ordinarily, you know, the IMF has been a famous guardian of monetarist policy and of saying to places like Greece, the first thing you have to do is control your interest rates, reduce public expenditure. This week, she said, a concern for viable markets means that we have to be worried about two great discrepancies in income. Now, there is a sign of someone's monetarist ideolatry beginning to crumble under the simple force of reality. If the IMF begins to look at economies along the lines of how people are remunerated, as well as how interest is charged, that by itself is a major change of policy as compared to the past 50 years. So in my view, and this may be the only place where we disagree, in my view, we are not hardwired for violence. In my view, the tendency to violence comes out as a result of identifiable distortions that we can know historically. And that's why, to my mind, part of the work of an historian is to understand why people react in these ways. Because once that is understood, one is on the way to discovering how a therapy might be applied to it. Yes, please.
Great.
You said that the 5 aspects of Islam that are considered fundamentalism are actually Christian or Catholic?
What I said was that in fundamentalism, as fundamentalists describe themselves, so what I want to be clear about is that mostly religious groups are given their names by someone else. So Christians are called Christians because people in the Roman Empire wanted to make fun of us. Jews are called Jews because people in Babylonia were trying to describe this group that came in from Judea. But in the case of fundamentalists themselves say what the fundamentals are. And they are that Scripture is inerrant, that Jesus was born of a biological virgin, that the miracles occurred literally, that when Jesus died on the cross, his blood was paying for your sin personally, and that Jesus was raised from the dead in the same body in which he died. No Muslim has ever gone along with any of those. In other words, Islam has different tenets altogether. Catholicism has different tenets. They overlap to some extent, but they're also different. So this is why I am cautious about taking the term fundamentalism and then transplanting it into different parts. It is, first of all, as you can tell by the fundamentals, it's not the same thing as literalism, right? Because the Bible doesn't say anything along these lines. Bible nowhere says we are all right all the time. Bible nowhere says these words are dictated by God. In fact, the Bible says that's not how they got there. And so on through the others. These are not literal citations of the Bible, Old or New Testaments. The claim of fundamentalism is these are basic axioms you have to accept to understand the Bible. Their claim is just as Darwin has his axioms, so we in Princeton, that's where it was invented, so we in Princeton have our axioms, and these are the axioms. So that strikes me as being a rather local phenomenon in origin. And therefore, to try to take that term and to apply it to Islam and the Soviet Union and Pol Pot and Adolf Hitler makes me crazy. I mean, I think therefore you have to look for some other family relationship among these movements. And that's why I'm experimenting now with the term ideology and saying, you could say fundamentalism is an example of ideology. You can say, when someone says Christianity is these 5 principles and you have to accept them to be a Christian, and I know they're not in the Bible, but you have to accept them anyhow, that's ideological. So I would say that fundamentalism belongs to this late Enlightenment desperation for meaning that leads to ideology. But you can also see it in certain applications of Marxism and of racist theory, and yes, of monetarism. You know, I think we see a kind of panicky response. And often it does come at the cost of the poor. I'm reminded of the apocryphal press conference. It is apocryphal, but it's too good not to repeat. Given by Barry Goldwater. You remember Barry Goldwater in 1964. And so the idea is the senator comes out and says, gentlemen, because then all the journalists were gentlemen, well, they were men. Gentlemen, I've decided that it's time in this country for us to have a 5-cent tax on day-old bread. And one of the journalists says, Senator, wouldn't that hurt poor people? And the response was, you've heard of my bill. There is a kind of coldness about a purely monetarist response and many other economic theories that don't wish to take account of human realities. Yes, please, Stuart.
I'm sure you'll cover this in the fall, but doesn't the church existing as an institution kind of necessitate some form of ideology?
Good question. The question is, doesn't the church, the fact that it exists as an institution, necessitate ideology? The church, in my judgment, because of the particular kind of Christian I am, actually needs creeds. Now, there are, of course, many kinds of Christian who say, well, only an Anglican would say that. You know, they would assert that you can speak of a direct relationship between the believer and God without the necessity of a creedal format. But let me take the position of creeds, because that will enable me to make the distinction, which I believe is crucial, between creeds and ideology. In the case of ideology, I am coming to a specific idea which I hold to be true within the particular analysis that I've been developing. So if I happen to be working on a problem in scholarship, for example, whatever my result is an idea, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I think I can take this idea that has come out of my analysis and apply it in different fields with the assumption that it is valid there. So an idea leading to an ideology is really the result of an analysis. The creeds were developed initially for the application within baptism. That's the function of the Apostles' Creed. And in its original Greek, what we call creed, which comes from the Latin credo, what we call creed was actually called symbolon. the same term that we have for symbol. And the reason for that is symbolon in Greek refers to the pulling together of how it is that we relate to God. And that's why the creed is always, whether it's the Apostles' Creed or the later developments, parsed into the forms of Father and Son and Spirit. The conception is that these are the dimensions in which we experience God, and the creed is there in order to locate us in relationship to God. I would hold that as different from an idea. As a result of the creed, I might have an idea of how Christ and God are related to one another, but the creed actually doesn't spell that out. It's an invitation to analyze, but it is not the same thing as a demand that you come to certain findings. It's very interesting, for example, that the creed might have insisted, like fundamentalist Christianity does, on Jesus being born of a biological virgin. But it doesn't say that. And in fact, the creed was actually recited by early Christians who thought that Joseph was Jesus' father, which is how he became a son of David. So you had different ideas of Jesus held by people who were sharing the same creed. A creed is supposed to operate that way. It's supposed to locate us in relation to God so that we might well develop ideas without specifying in advance just what those ideas are. Yes, please, Isabel. By the way, many people coming in commented on our flowers. And Isabel is one of our principal gardeners. So we want to thank Isabel for the flowers.
Thank you for the encouragement. I just was thinking about your optimistic idea, and I was thinking, I just saw in passing this commentary on the forgiveness being taught in Rwanda, and that it's a very effective program. I read it quick, so I didn't get into more, but apparently there's some really good results. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yeah, that has been very effective in Rwanda, and basically it is picking up the ideas of Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa in his Peace and Reconciliation Commission. I think that when one looks at the underlying principles of that kind of program, you can see us moving away from the system I just referred to. This system of both of modern Christianity and of ideologies that focus on the particular community involved tends necessarily to look down on those outside the community. But the principles of peace and reconciliation demand that you give up that notion of a finite community, and you begin to look instead at conceptions of inclusion. That's one of the shifts which I plan on investigating next semester. I think it is a good example of a sign of hope. Yes, please.
In the discussion, it seems there's a biblical measurement that has not been introduced, and that is, by their fruits you shall know them. Ideas and whether they benefit or whether they harm are recognized in terms of results. I don't hear that in this discussion.
I think that's very helpful, the conception that we ought to be able to test a motivation, test a program by its actual outcome. One of the signs of an ideology is that you don't do that because you're already convinced you're right. Why, therefore, should you require evidence that you're heading in the right direction? I think that's one of the ways in which an ideology becomes self-reinforcing. And you find yourself coming up with exactly the same solution no matter what the problem is. The old proverb to a carpenter who has only one tool, a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So when I listen to some economic discussion at the moment, I hear a steady repetition of the same nostrums, which have turned out not to work. If you know they don't work and you keep doing them, you're either an ideologue or you're crazy, or maybe both. But this I think, is the craziness that we're living in the midst of. And that's what I refer to as the postmodern dilemma. And the dilemma, part of it, is that it can be very difficult to call attention to just how ethically bankrupt this kind of approach makes us. I was happy that we had sunshine for such a depressing idea. Yes, please.
What you just said, there are a few people like Paul Krugman who are Keynesians who are giving voice to an alternative. So what I wanted to ask you, maybe you'll address it in the fall. It seems that most of the conflicts in my lifetime are between the Balkan conflict, or the conflicts in Africa between Muslims and Christians, or the Muslims and Hindus, or in India and Pakistan, or Roman Catholics and Protestants in Ireland. So are you saying that it's not the religion itself, it's the, and I thought you were saying idiotic, and it seems like the idiot part was, very germane.
I might use that, yeah.
But are you saying that it's not the religion itself, but somehow it serves as a vehicle for the idiotic things that people are, the Ayn Rand phenomenon?
Yeah, this is a helpful question. When we look at genocides, and specifically the genocides I mentioned, as I said, to say that religion was the principal cause, or even the secondary cause, doesn't seem plausible. On the other hand, there are genocides in which there's clearly a religious element, and sometimes it is used as the way in which you develop popular support for your particular position. But take the worst genocides in the subcontinent of India. Pakistanis against Bangladeshis. The victims were mostly Muslim. And there are many instances in India and in Africa where what we hear is, oh, this is Christian-Muslim violence. What's happening right now in Central Africa, for example, and also in Nigeria. Christian-Muslim violence. Well, why? We have a pigeonhole for that, right? And it suits our Enlightenment ideas that if only people would get over religion, they'd be completely peaceful. Like the Soviets. All right. But then in Africa, what doesn't get on the radar is that most of the Christians you're referring to are farmers, and most of the Muslims you're referring to are herders. And I don't know whether you've noticed, but herders and farmers, especially in situations of drought, don't get along well at all. I mean, what was happening in Texas during the 19th century, and then you add into this mix sheep or cattle or farm, what was happening in Texas was not a religious dispute. It was a dispute over the use of land. And much of what's happening in Nigeria, in Central Africa, in the Sudan, and Darfur is also over the use of land, in which, yes, it is true, religious rhetoric can be added, but most people observing the scene do not see this primarily as being a religious dispute. That is why one of the stories you persistently hear whenever violence erupts in this way is people saying, I don't understand Before all of this fell apart, we were intermarrying, we were neighbors. It was possible for us to have a free contact with one another. Same kind of comments are coming up in Egypt now, with the persecution of Coptic Christians. The forces at work would not have been religion if those same forces were there when they were at peace. Clearly, there appears to be something else that's going on. And in each case, one wants to look for what the ideology is. If it happens to be a religious ideology, I'm happy to own it as such. But it would be at most a very low percentage of these genocides. And in the case of Northern Ireland in particular, you know, how did Northern Ireland get there? The British put it there. They transplanted it. It's the case of British colonialism within the British Isles. So yeah, there's going to be a conflict over these populations, and once you establish the Republic of Éire and you have that distinction from Northern Ireland, there's going to be extraordinary difficulty. But is this a Protestant Catholic dispute?
It's a class dispute in a way, and so it's the Hindus having been ruled by Muslims for years and years.
Exactly. Class also features into it. So for the most part, it turns out that people in genocidal situations are motivated by a complex series of motivations. But people living at peace are motivated by a complex series of motivations. That's the way human beings are. So the challenge is to discover what within that situation is bringing about the alignment of these motivations in the interests of a genocide. And what I'm saying is the family relationship among all these cases, and the ones that you refer to, is the claim that there's going to be a single solution and that no other solution is possible. In the case of Northern Ireland, the belief of the IRA at one time that the only solution was one Ireland, opposed to the belief by those in Northern Ireland that the only solution was loyalty to the monarch. You had two ideologies that refused to talk to one another until they started to talk to one another. The situation has improved. Yes, please.
I'd like to say something about Ireland. And my ancestry is entirely English and Haudenosaunee, Iroquois. And my forebears, in fact, some of them were among the people who were sent not from Scotland, but from northern England, because they were on these, poor people, outlaws, the Border Reaver descendants into Northern Ireland, but they didn't stay. They went straight to Canada after a very short time. And as far as the genocide in Ireland, the Northern and Southern Ireland is one issue, and the genocide really isn't appropriate. It might be in Armenia, I don't know enough about it, but certainly even the British government didn't intend to kill all the Irish. They simply didn't do what they should have done. I mean, Queen Victoria even sent money far too late. But imagine Hitler sending a check, however small, for 3 marks or whatever, to help the Jews. And you see that it couldn't have been genocide in that sense. And I've suffered a great deal from being only English and Iroquois in America, where those are not the most popular things to be. And every kind of ethnic argument. Now, this is different, but I wanted to ask if you like the work of Professor Pinker at Harvard, who says that, we are becoming less violent. I think that's a wonderful idea. I wondered what you think of it.
I like the idea. I wish there was more evidence to support it, because I do think that we are living through a genocide in a way is the most obvious part of the problem. The other is that in ordinary warfare, the idea of targeting civilians has become routine. And that in the economic equivalent of warfare, the proposal that we should withhold goods and services that we know people need in order to live has also become acceptable. So this is the part of me which is darker and not optimistic. I think that we are in a situation where what amounts to violence has become routinized, and that we need to see a reversal of that, actually, in order for us to have any prospect for reasonable survival.
I favor Jesus' idea that violence is never the answer.
Except if you're in the temple.
That's a saying.
Yes, please, Betsy.
You mentioned that the printing press helped the spread of Martin Luther's beliefs. Now, we have mass communications, we have mega churches, we have radio evangelism. And we have some of the mainline churches really diminishing. How is that going to affect what happens in the future?
Mm-hmm. I think the issue of mass communication, which Betsy raises, is crucial to this discussion, and of how it is that within all the mass of communication, we can winnow away static and come to the point where people can join in an analysis of what actually would be more productive for their societies and also for their personal faith. At the moment, because these forms of communication are largely under commercial control, our ability to use them productively has been limited. And as you mentioned, somehow mainline churches have tended on the whole, not always, but mainline churches have tended on the whole to give up communication and to leave it to those who practice ideology. That's an interesting strategy. I don't know why anyone thought that particular strategy would work. In any case, we've tried it now, and we know it doesn't work. So it might be time to see an increased interest in communicating, in the work of education. To some extent, this comes about because mainline churches have really fallen into what I regard as a kind of wimpy idea of the separation of church and state. They've taken that to mean, oh, that means we shouldn't say anything. No, it's not what it means. It really is not what it means. Separation of church and state means no hierarchical figure in the church will govern. That's plainly stated, actually, in the original Constitution of New York State, before it ever got to the United States Constitution. New York State made this very clear. You're not going to have to pass legislation in front of a bishop or a priest or anything like it before it becomes law. That's what the separation of church and state means. It doesn't mean, oh, Christians have to keep quiet. That's been one of our problems. There was too much quiet in the Third Reich. There was also opposition. Dietrich Bonhoeffer died as part of a plot to kill Hitler. That's taking a stand, no doubt about it. Especially when he could have been living in New York as a professor. Pretty good move. So there were those who clearly, this is called the confessing church in Germany, who opposed the Third Reich. But there wasn't enough opposition. There was not enough opposition in the United States to slavery or to segregation. There has not been enough opposition to the way in which poverty has again emerged as a lethal problem within our society. We should be willing to be very open about these things and to take to the airways if we need to in order to get that done. But we tend to keep our light under a bushel, which is also not a good idea, according to a sage I know. Yes, please. I think we should make this the last question. Yeah,
Okay.
I read the cardinal correctly.
Okay, what about the role of economics? Why the church is silent? Because they rely upon their congregation, and would they speak up against this inequality? Then what's the reaction within the congregation?
Right. Well, I can answer to that. I mean, what would the reaction be within the congregation if one spoke against inequality in economics? When I do, I get into some trouble, but not enough trouble to bother me. And it seems to me that probably more in the congregation understand the nature of the analysis than are offended by it. So I'm sure that this is a fear that people have, but you know, part of the practice of faith is to get over fear and just acknowledge that at times it needs to be confronted. Well, thank you very much. This has been a good time.